Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's PSC webinar. We're just going to wait a minute here and let more folks join in, and then we'll get started. Share my screen. Can everyone see that?
We're seeing the presenter view.
Oh, okay.
We have been in a terrible job.
That better?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is John Spearman. I'm the project manager for the Pet Sustainability Coalition. I'm glad to be here with you to talk about carbon neutral certification. However, before jumping into that, we have our first poll of the day. And while you all are answering that poll, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about PSC. So the first poll is, at which step of the carbon neutrality is your organization? Conducting research, just starting the process, measuring your carbon footprint, setting reduction goals, purchasing offsets, or delivering on internal reductions. Now, a little bit about those who are joining us for the first time. PSC is a nonprofit organization founded in 2013. Our mission is to advocate or advance business through environmental and social practices. We have a vision for a vibrant and collaborative pet industry that has a positive impact on the communities where we do business. PSC is a movement of retailers, distributors, manufacturers, and brands coming together to measure, improve, and celebrate our environmental and social impact. Originally founded with 8 companies, we are now a global organization with almost 200 members, a company on every continent except Antarctica. Now it looks like we've had a minute here to take the poll. I'm going to close it and share the results. I want to thank everyone for taking a minute to do that. It looks like the bulk of everyone is conducting research into this process at about 40%, and about a quarter of everyone is on the just starting and getting through the carbon footprint, measuring the carbon footprint. So thank you all for taking that poll, and we're going to keep it moving. So the slide must move. Just a little bit more about PSC before we jump into it. We have 2 primary ways that we work as an organization. Our first is support members like you on your sustainability goals and improvement through member benefits. Our next major areas of focus are collaboration within the collaboration on the big issues in the industry that impact everyone, but are too big for one company to handle. We have identified 3 areas as cornerstone initiatives, and those are, as you can see on the screen, sustainable proteins, sustainable packaging, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. A little webinar etiquette as we go through today. Just a reminder that microphones and videos are off. There's a Q&A function chat at the bottom of the screen. Please feel free to put your questions in there at any time during today's presentation. There's also a chat feature in there. PSC staff will be monitoring that. And copies of today's slides and the recording will be sent to all registrants after today's call. So to get started, very excited to have here with us Austin Whitman, the Chief Executive Officer at Climate Neutral, and our other guest, Jennifer Cooper, who's the Vice President of Climate Strategy at Native Energy. And I will pass it off to Austin to start telling us a little bit more about climate neutrality.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me here. It's good to be talking to you all about the topic that I work on every day, and that is carbon neutrality or climate neutrality. And we won't get too hung up on language there, because unless you get into the really deep technical details, they're basically the same thing. So before I get into the substance here, just a couple fun facts. I've been working in climate for the better part of 20 years, and back in grad school in 2007, I led an initiative to make to make our graduation ceremony carbon neutral. And one of the things that we did was purchase carbon credits from Native Energy, where Jennifer works, and this is our purchase record from that year, 2007. So thought that would be kind of a fun little archive to dig up, and that was a good trip down memory lane. So definitely have worked in carbon markets for a long time, and we'll talk a little bit more about the work that we're doing at Climate Neutral. Because this is the Pet Sustainability Coalition, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention shout out to our backyard chickens. This is Patricia, and our 13-year-old Australian Shepherd, Griffin, looking exceptionally snowy on a day in the wintertime here in Boston. So, as I said, good to be with you all. The main framework that I was going to take you all through is just pretty straightforward. What's in a corporate climate initiative? So we see a lot of corporate climate action these days. It's tremendous to see how much is happening in terms of companies really starting to recognize their responsibility in the broader climate movement. There's so many reasons why companies are doing this, but fundamentally, if you break down really anything that you see when it comes to corporate climate action, you can think of it in 4 different ways. And if I were running a corporate program, this is sort of how I would think about organizing the work that we were doing. And it starts with a pledge, and that is to say, what are you going to tell the world that you're going to do by some date in the future, 2030, 2040, 2050. And that's really kind of a long-term anchoring goal or anchoring, kind of vision that will drive the work that's to come. But it's really not everything. And some companies, in essence, kind of stop there. They say, well, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2070. Now leave us alone and let us get back to work. A pledge has to be backed up by the rest of what's here. So a goal which is more of a short-term set of things that you're going to accomplish in pursuit of achieving the long-term pledge. And we'll get into a little bit about what that means. And then investment. And this is a really important one that we emphasize. And this is to say that you really have to be thinking about the fact that business activities really are going to need to change in some way, whether you're spending money on carbon credits or investing in R&D or new suppliers. There needs to be some form of investment that's happening that wouldn't have happened otherwise to really substantiate a corporate climate initiative. And then finally, a claim. And we do have a certification and a label that we offer at Climate Neutral, but in some way, shape, or form, you're going to be talking about what you're doing about climate change. So Climate Neutral was founded 4 years ago. I co-founded it with a couple of folks from the outdoor products industry, and our goal was to really put some structure around these kinds of elements of corporate climate action, both to accelerate it as well as to make sure that companies were recognizing that there needs to be a minimum bar for what companies are doing when they're talking about climate action. So I'm going to break these down a little bit now, and then I'll tie it together with some specifics about what we do at Climate Neutral. So to look a little bit more deeply at the pledge part, what you'll often see out there is companies set a long-term pledge around a target year, and the most kind of useful framework around thinking about target years is this idea that we have to get the world to net zero by 2050. And that has really put a stake in the ground that in the last 4 or 5 years has been an effective way of getting people to think, okay, what am I going to be doing over the long term? And thousands of companies have now set net zero goals, and as well as countries, as well as states and different entities out there. So you can pledge that you're going to be net zero by 2040 or pledge to be carbon neutral by 2030 or hit 100% renewable energy by 2027. But in essence, this is the thing that starts the conversation going. And some of the ways that we've seen pledges take shape, two examples here. Amazon in 2020 said that they are going to achieve net zero carbon by 2040. And Microsoft came out and said that it was going to be carbon negative by 2030. So these are, again, examples of pledges. Our view is that pledges are a good organizing principle. They do start the drum beating, but they're certainly not enough. And one of the things that we've heard from companies is, even though there was a pledge, people couldn't answer the question, what are you going to do this year? So that's where the goals come in. And a goal is really, in our world, sort of something that you're going to begin to implement immediately. And this is how you break down progress toward that pledge into more meaningful and immediate steps. So what's your team going to be ready to mobilize to accomplish now? Some examples here: reduce emissions from shipping by cutting air freight, sourcing and using recycled material inputs, beginning to redesign your products to cut your average emissions per SKU, or buying renewable energy. And an example that we've seen around specific goal setting is here from Netflix's sustainability page. They have this idea that they're working toward a long-term net zero target, which is aligned with the 1.5 degree warming level. And that's, again, tied to this idea of net zero by 2050. But their immediate goal has been to start to reduce emissions, and they've given you some examples here. So scope 1 and 2 footprint, reducing by 10%, and then getting on track to meet their goal of 45% of reductions by 2030 in scope 1 and 2, utilities, landlords, renewable electricity, renewable diesel, etc. So these are some immediate goals that the folks at Netflix are implementing. The third item there was investment, and we see this framed out very differently depending on the company that we're working with. But the fundamental question is, how much of your budget are you really prepared to dedicate to the efforts that are going to support your progress toward that long-term pledge? I think in the ideal world, a company has decided that it's going to allocate a certain amount of money in the form of an internal carbon tax, and then divide that out into different uses. So for example, you might see a $15 per ton internal carbon tax that gets assessed, and then you divide that out into different ways across the organization. In some cases, you'll see companies say that they're going to spend $10 per ton on carbon offsets, as an example, or $15,000 is our budget for renewable energy, or we're going to set aside a salary for a dedicated person who's going to work on implementing the climate plan. So these are some of the ways that you might slice and dice the idea of investment. But we'd like to see something that's very quantitative. And I think one of the things that you're starting to hear more and more is a lot of concern around pledges not being backed up by a specific investment. So there was a report that came out recently about the number of companies that have made net zero pledges, but unfortunately, the extent to which companies are lagging on progress toward those net zero pledges. And I would say that most of the frameworks that are out there that companies are pursuing are really not tied to specific investment numbers. So there's a goal, but then the money has not been kind of mobilized behind that. And this is really going to be something that everyone will reckon with over the coming years as we realize whether we're meeting progress toward those long-term pledges or not. So an example here comes from Seventh Generation. So they have imposed an internal carbon tax. This is that first way of quantifying investment that I mentioned. And they've got an internal carbon tax of $12 in this example. And they take that money and they invest it into programs focused on sustainability. And they've got lots more information as to how that works within their sustainability report. Which brings us to the fourth piece, which is the claim, which is how you talk about it all. So a lot of the work that we do ends up coming back to folks in the marketing department. They're charged with translating the climate work out to out to the world, whether that's consumers or to employees or to other stakeholders. So marketing is sort of the first venue. We see a lot in social media. We see a lot in sustainability reporting. We also see marketing happening in the real world, where companies will put a claim or a label or information onto a package somewhere. So that kind of gets to the idea of how the claim is being put forth in terms of commerce. There are also claims and reports that will go sometimes to investors or to shareholders. We're seeing a big push toward better disclosure and reporting on climate progress and emissions out to shareholders and investors. And that's going to be increasingly regulated by the SEC here in the US. And there's already quite an active framework for reporting on that in Europe. And then I briefly mentioned employees, but employees have been a really interesting kind of additional audience that we see companies trying to speak to the extent that people are coming in and interviewing for jobs and saying, what are you doing about climate? What are you doing about sustainability? And candidates really want to know what the company has committed to doing. And so the claim, part of the claim ends up needing to be translated into language that excites folks who are thinking about working for your organization. So that kind of walks you through the four elements. We see quite a lot of messaging out there now in the world, and it all has kind of mixed, I would say, mixed effectiveness and depth. A couple examples of claims here. Walmart has talked about placing nature and people at the heart of their business, achieving zero emissions across global operations by 2040. Aldo is a shoe company. We do not work with them, but they have a carbon neutrality program. And then up here on the right, we've got an example of one of our certified brands. And so I think one of the big fundamental questions is, as we start to look at more and more company messaging like this and company claims, the question is how much of it is really credible. So we have to get into some more detail on, I think this is where we at Climate Neutral have tried to shape people's understanding of what should be happening under each of these types of activities as part of a climate plan. And just to work through these each one by one, in terms of the pledge, something that's net zero aligned, again, coming back to that 1.5 degree C warming target, you want to have a pledge that is aligned with net zero, and that's long term. But you also want to make sure that that's not it when it comes to your climate initiative. So the goal should specify this year's and next year's actions in very concrete terms. The investment should have dollars per ton of emissions that are being spent and invested in GHG reduction and mitigation starting now. And then the claim needs to have regular progress that's reported and transparency on what the claim is. And if you're putting a label or marketing statements out there, people need to be able to understand them so that they can actually trust them. One of the other really important foundational pieces of this whole structure is what you choose to count. What share of your overall emissions are you including in a climate program? And the term boundaries is maybe something that you've heard of. And what you tend to see is larger companies in particular will draw relatively narrow boundaries around their operations and really decide to take kind of responsibility for a small share of their total emissions, and then make that the basis for all the subsequent work on reductions and mitigation. And in our view, everyone needs to take responsibility for a much larger share than just the emissions, for example, from one factory or one office building. The cradle to customer or cradle to grave emissions should be included, something that's a lot more comprehensive. And that the inventory that you create should be actionable. So you should be able to look at the carbon footprint, the carbon measurement report, and be able to understand what you then start to do about your emissions. The analysis should lead to planning and high impact actions. We put together a tool called the Brand Emissions Estimator that allows folks to go in and enter some information. And I've included a URL here to that tool and the information as to how it works. There are lots of other carbon measurement tools out there. One of the other things, and this of course comes directly home to the work that we do, is regardless of what framework you decide to implement, it should be tied to standards. It should be tied to frameworks that have been vetted by numerous outside experts and developed with an eye toward rigor, with an eye toward credibility, with an eye toward impact. And the more you can tie your work to something that has been independently identified as a good way to have impact, the more credible it's all going to be. So we have underpinning our certification, we have a standard that does provide a common language across all the companies that we work with. The idea is that it's very simple, easy for people to understand, but also sets the bar pretty high when it comes to accountability and transparency. And again, we have a comprehensive approach to the boundary setting process. To drill down a one level deeper, and this will kind of segue nicely into what Jennifer will be presenting on, the steps in getting certified climate neutral involve measuring your emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3 from cradle to customer, and then submitting a bunch of documentation on the data that you're using to do that measurement, coming up with reduction action plans, and then setting science-aligned reduction targets for 2030. That's our equivalent of that pledge that I talked about earlier. And then reporting annually as you come to get recertified on the progress that you're making toward your reduction actions. And we've seen now well over 1,000 reduction actions across the companies that we work with. And what's exciting is we get to look at the progress that they're making toward those reduction actions and start to understand better how companies are doing on different types of reduction actions, whether it's packaging or whether it's renewable energy purchasing or working in more detailed ways with suppliers. And then the final step here is to compensate for emissions, which is our general term for purchasing carbon credits, purchasing renewable energy credits, and overall making sure that as you go along, all the emissions that you're still responsible for are being mitigated through investments outside of your value chain. And it's important to do that following best practices for carbon credits, looking at things like verification by third parties, vintage year of the carbon credit, project types that are providing the projects, and where those projects are. So we have all three of these components reflected in our standard document, which is again linked here at this URL. And then the final piece, as I mentioned earlier, making credible claims. And we have a label that we use to support the claim. And then there's information on what that label means. Increasingly, labels and claims are being regulated. And this year, the FTC here in the US is going to be updating its green guide, or it's starting the process to update its green guide, which is the document that shapes how people should and should not be talking about environmental claims generally. So we're watching that process closely and want to make sure that what we're doing is understandable above all else, understandable to consumers, and where companies are backing up their claims with action. So that's it for me. Our hope is that we can create a world where all consumers are able to find brands that have taken these kinds of steps, that have a really credible climate program, and that companies have the tools to do it immediately and credibly, and where the emphasis is really on long-term mitigation and elimination of emissions. So it's great to be here with you all. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to the discussion to come. And with that, I will hand it over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Austin. And thanks for the really fun flashback and the highlighting the link going back to your time of graduation. That was really neat. And I will also, it was fun to see your dog in the snow. And maybe I can show you guys my pet. I'm presenting with Ranger today. She's a mix of lots of different types of dogs and just a super, super great pet, but she doesn't want to stay on screen, so I'll let her go. I'm really glad to be here. thanks for inviting us to talk about this interesting and also challenging subject. Oh, how do I advance my slides? Sorry, guys.
There you go.
Okay. So a framework like the one that Austin was describing is, for a number of obvious reasons, a really great help in organizing your efforts to set, measure, track progress, and communicate results. Now we thought it would be interesting and helpful to delve a little into how to reduce emissions. So reducing emissions year over year is the core of any credible climate program, as Austin was talking about. It's that lasting change that we're all looking for and that's going to matter. So we wanted to ask, what are some of the primary sources of emissions for the pet industry and how to tackle them? And hopefully this will be helpful. Looking at the poll that John sent out at the beginning, lots of people are still in the conducting research and figuring out stage of things. So among the sources of greenhouse gas emissions for your industry, of course, are manufacturing, transportation, and that's transportation of raw materials, of processed inputs, and of final products, as well as emissions from ingredients, in particular, agriculturally derived ingredients. There's also end of life and packaging and some other things that aren't represented in this pie, but those are some of the main ones. And John's put up another poll, invited to comment on that if you wish. And what's common for many of us then here today, and indeed for a lot of other industry sectors as well, is the ability to include both efficiency and fuel switching in our plans for and our focus for emission reduction efforts. That applies to both emissions coming from transportation and emissions coming from processing and manufacturing. So digging in to find efficiencies that reduce energy use and reduce fuel use while simultaneously and systematically switching to renewable sources and low carbon energy and fuel sources will drive emission reductions for most organizations and their suppliers. Great. For those with agricultural ingredients in their product lines, it may be interesting to look at a few key ingredient types. So we have here grains, plant-based oils, and animal proteins. For the first two, both grains and plant-based oils, it's the use of nitrogen fertilizers, which are releasing nitrogen in the form of greenhouse gas, nitrogen and 2O are a significant source of emissions. It varies, of course, by the type of crop or grain or the type of plant-based oil, but across many, nitrogen fertilizer use is a key source of emissions in the making of that fertilizer and then in its application as well. So where you are able and can find opportunity to be working with suppliers to reduce the use of these fertilizers, which can come through practice changes, through technology that really targets where and when to apply specific amounts of these fertilizers, alternatives to these nitrogen-based inorganic fertilizers, and even looking at things like cover crops that will fix more nitrogen and other solutions. Working with suppliers on these types of things is really key to addressing this particular source of emissions long term. A second important source of emissions, both for grains and plant-based oils, is fossil fuel use for both farm machinery and transportation at various stages. So finding opportunities over time to make the switch to renewable and low carbon fuels is a worthwhile point of focus. If we look at the third type of input highlighted here, livestock, looking for ways to address methane from both enteric sources, depending on the animal, and manure, depending on the type of manure management, and the methane that's coming from those sources provides another really important opportunity to reduce emissions. And this is certainly a topic on which to be collaborating with or finding ways to directly support suppliers. More broadly, we have gathered here a bit of information from an initiative called the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, which has put forward a playbook that points to a list of actions that smaller organizations can be taking, both to reduce their emissions directly and to be reducing emissions with their suppliers, as well as contributing to climate action within society. The Exponential Roadmap Initiative is just one of many great resources out there giving suggestions, ideas, recommendations, support, and tools for finding ways to pinpoint certain emission sources and then address those and reduce over time. So for this section of the playbook, when it comes to your own emissions, the initiative is suggesting things like retrofitting and automating energy use in your own buildings, again, systematically and over time. It points to the benefits of and the opportunity to transition refrigerants, heating, cooling, and ventilation systems to renewable or low carbon energy sources, and to evolving the vehicle fleet. This is one that Austin highlighted in one of his examples, both owned vehicles and leased vehicles, transitioning those to electric or low carbon fuels. If going beyond your own sort of scope 1 or direct emissions and looking into the value chain, this particular resource points to opportunities for lowering the amount of material used and also shifting to recycled and low carbon plastics and metals. In this case, they point specifically to steel and aluminum. Recommends seeking to eliminate deforestation and or the use of materials that are drivers for deforestation globally. It also puts some emphasis on transitioning to regenerative agriculture. And again, that would be a point on which to seek out and collaborate with suppliers, and as well as a focus on circularity and embedding circularity into your own design. So looking at things like extending product life, requiring less material, using recycled and low carbon materials, and also securing recycling or some sort of recapture and reuse at the end of product life. And a slight departure, but the last one that we wanted to include reminds each of us to really use our voice. So as a large or a small organization, we can each be contributing to advocacy at various levels of society to be pushing more urgently for a just and swift transition to a lower carbon future. And here, the advice is really to lean on peers and existing initiatives to lend your voice, your organization's time and funding to advocacy on climate action. And this is the way that all of us can sort of stretch beyond what our organization and our own suppliers are doing directly to reduce emissions to further accelerate things. And with that, I hope we can now begin a conversation by taking a few questions.
Thank you both, Austin and Jennifer, for the wonderful presentation. I will jump in and look at, there are several questions already. So the first one is, what is the difference between net zero and carbon neutrality? Which is a very good question for some folks who may not know.
Austin, I suggest you take that.
Yeah, big and important difference. So first of all, there are lots of definitions out there. And I'm sure if you go online, you can find many different interpretations of net zero. And for a while, I think there wasn't even a whole lot of consensus on what net zero means. But over the last couple of years, even though you can still find lots of different definitions, there has been more and more of a consensus that net zero is really a future state that the world is trying to achieve. And it's not the same as carbon neutrality. and that net zero is really a point that a company or a country or a state has reached once it has exhausted all of its available carbon reduction options and has gotten its emissions down as close to zero as possible. And so we think of that net zero as sort of a future state by definition. It's impossible to run a net zero business in 2023 because you will rely on something in your operations that causes carbon emissions. Climate neutrality or carbon neutrality is a state that you can reach today by taking very near-term reduction actions and then investing to compensate for your emissions through renewable energy credits and carbon credits and what have you. So you can think of carbon neutrality or climate neutrality really as a stepping stone on the way to net zero. And in our world, you kind of achieve that neutrality status every year as you're reducing emissions over the long term, so that in the ideal world, everybody is moving together toward a net zero future and we all land there somewhere between 2040 and 2050.
Thank you, Austin. The next question, to become climate neutral certified, is that for scope 1 and 2 only, or do you have to include scope 3?
Yeah, so our certification framework is based around a cradle to customer boundary. So that includes scope 3 emissions upstream and then all the way downstream just through shipping products to customers. So in greenhouse gas protocol language, it's scope 1, scope 2, and then scope 3 subcategories 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9. We don't include use phase emissions for a number of reasons that I won't get into here, but we think that that's the most meaningful boundary from the perspective of the customer. So when you're actually there online or you're in a store and you're buying the product, you could read a very simple label and understand exactly what's been done to make that product carbon neutral.
Thank you. The next question is a two-parter. Can you list some of the climate neutral certified clients, and have you considered a climate neutral by 20-something year seal, which would measure appropriate progress in order to use? Yeah,
so all of our certified brands are listed on our website, climateneutral.org/certified-brands. Beco Pets, I know, is a PSC member, one of our climate neutral certified brands. We also work with Petaluma, which also is a pet food company. So in addition to that, others, lots in the outdoor industry, REI and Vuori and Allbirds and so forth. And then, so that's kind of a answer to the first part. We have certainly been asked many times to provide a label or a certification of intent to work or a future progress, and have felt uncomfortable with that because of the challenge of communicating what that really means to consumers. And that's the test that ultimately the Federal Trade Commission is looking at. Do consumers understand what you're doing and what the claim is? And our view is that you have very limited time to explain yourself to somebody who's making a decision online. And if they can't get it really quickly, then the FTC can say, you know what, this claim isn't valid. And frankly, I think a lot of climate claims out there would probably not fall on the right side of compliance with FTC guidelines. So we'll see a lot more happening there in the coming years. But for now, we've decided no labels other than just the one climate neutral certified. We do work with a number of companies who are planning to get certified at some point in the future, but don't support public claims by those companies.
Thank you. Next question, are there any discussions on reducing the amount of livestock? I think this is referring to one of your slides, Jennifer.
Can you repeat that question, John?
Yep. Are there any discussions questions on reducing the amount of livestock? Of-
Certainly, I think a lot of guidance says, eat meat, choose meat less often, look for meat alternatives. There's also another line of thinking, which is, where livestock are roaming the land, playing a role in regenerating grassland ecosystems. There can be some benefits there. So there's lots to think about, I think, and talk about overall. It has a lot to do, the types, the ways the animals are managed has a lot to do with the emissions that will be generated. And so a lot of it is looking at livestock management and how they are fed, how they move around the landscape, what type of landscape they're on. So I think a lot of the most productive conversation is sort of around those aspects of it. In what they eat and how they move and how their manure is managed are really key drivers for emissions from the cycle there.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next question is, what role does packaging play with carbon neutrality or net zero?
I was just trying to phone a friend here to see if I had actual numbers to answer this question with.
I think, Austin, we could probably really roughly say packaging, generalizing across the types of products, is like a 5 to 10%-ish of the life cycle of at least most of the products I'm envisioning. But yeah, I hand it to you, Austin.
I think that's spot on with where I would have said our numbers. We have data, from lots of carbon measurement, and I think one of the things that we see with packaging is people assume that because there's a lot of emphasis on plastic and single-use materials, that it's going to be a huge chunk of your footprint. Really, what's in the package is what makes a difference. But packaging is important. So yeah, I think I'd probably guess 3 to 7% on average across the companies that we're measuring. So it is a good thing to include on the reduction action plan, but it's not something that will, if you deal with your packaging emissions as much as you can, that it will solve the entire problem.
Great, thank you. Next question, what are key things to look out for to find impactful and reputable carbon offset programs?
I think we both have opinions on this, but Jennifer, why don't you go first?
Yes, I would say really spending the time to understand the project and type of project that you're thinking of supporting. Ultimately, your money, your investment should be having an impact, making a difference, and a type of climate action that is needed and is going to last and be part of that transition to a lower carbon future. So really understanding, what is this project? How did it come about? What does it take to make it happen and continue to make it happen? And how are things tracked and monitored and measured over time? It's really important because there's lots of different facets of these projects, and you want to understand that what you're supporting is in line with the things that are important to you, climate and maybe other aspects as well, community development, providing economic opportunities in particular regions or communities, biodiversity, improvements or impacts, a number of things. So I would say the first and foremost is to really dig in. And if you're working with someone who's less able to answer those questions, they can probably point you in the right direction and get you connected with information on the offset project that you're thinking of supporting.
Excellent.
Yeah, plus one to all that. We look at a long list of criteria when we're trying to figure out what to include in what we call our eligible carbon credit criteria list, and everything that we do require is noted in the standard that I talked about earlier. The important things that we look at are, when was the project originated? So what is the vintage year? We look at the project type, and we don't allow all project types. We also look at geography. We don't allow all geographies. We don't allow, some projects we exclude in certain geographies just based on what we know about where the highest impact projects are. We also try to make sure that people are investing in a diverse array of projects, and we don't subscribe to the belief that only one type of project is the way to go. That there's a lot of value in supporting multiple different project types because emissions come from so many different places, and it's really important to make sure that we're funding transitions in sectors ranging from forestry to energy and so forth. So portfolio diversification is an important criteria for us as well. And then, as Jennifer said, it really helps to understand the underlying project. And if you've, I'm sure, read any of the press recently about some of the challenges in the carbon markets, I guess off the bat, I would say most of the analysis and the press that has been put out there is really based on a very, very narrow slice of the market. And while certainly, I think the whole industry needs to welcome critique or criticism because it then opens the door to improvements, that the bold headline about the entire market is broken is really just not true. And I think it helps to understand that it helps to take a deeper look at the projects that are going well. And there again, kind of understanding of the underlying project is helpful. And your provider should be able to tell you about the project.
And maybe it's something worth just on perspective on that. When we're offsetting our emissions, we're basically trying to negate or balance out something that has happened, a unit of pollution that went into the atmosphere, and then balance that out by supporting something else. So I think linking to the investment piece that you talked about, importantly, Austin, it's okay to plan to invest some significant time into really looking at where and how you want to offset, because it's a meaningful step that you're taking.
Thank you. Let's see, next question. When putting together a plan, do you think it's more important to prioritize one avenue, for example, energy or transportation, or is it critical to make movement on a lot of actions simultaneously?
Certainly, and Austin, you can speak to this because you will have seen so many of the plans coming forward, but planning, understanding where those sources of emissions are, which levers you can pull, so where you have some control or influence, and then planning to make change and reductions on a number of fronts is definitely the most solid approach. Whether you can do all of those immediately given access to resources and budgets and things, but putting those forward in a plan to try to move on a number of fronts and make change across a number of regions is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about patterns in what we've seen around actually fulfilling plans, and typically the biggest obstacles that come up when somebody's unable to complete a reduction action tie to how much support they have across the organization for investing in the kinds of operational changes and other changes that are needed. And I think, so the plan that has the highest likelihood of being fulfilled is where there's already a budget. It doesn't take more than one or two people to actually go ahead and implement the plan, and it can be done in a relatively short time frame. So, if I were starting from scratch, those are the things that I would focus on first. But typically those yield the smallest reductions, and the larger reductions are going to come from things that are more complicated. So they will involve more people, they'll involve more money, and they'll take more time. And so it's important to set in motion the actions within your organization that are going to allow you to achieve those longer term reductions. And in some cases, they get really complicated. Companies that we work with are actually looking hard at whether to build their own factories or tie up exclusive purchasing supply from certain raw material providers. So those are big decisions, and they take longer, cost more money, take more people. So I would say, there's kind of no right answer, because every organization is different, but it's helpful to prioritize and kind of think about the things that you can do soon to get some quick wins, to build some momentum so that you can start to work on longer term, more complex things.
Great. And the questions keep rolling in. This one is just a little clarification on the difference between net zero and carbon neutrality. Materially or practically, is the difference that net zero does not require offsets? Or what's the difference in a way that you could measure?
Yeah, so I think, again, we're trying to kind of understand, I think, what the consensus is on what net zero means. And in general, the consensus on net zero is that you cannot just offset your way to net zero. That a path to net zero essentially exhausts all reduction options over a longer period of time, decades from now, really. And that by the end of that period of exhausting your reduction options, then whatever's left, you are able to invest in carbon credits, carbon removal credits, carbon avoidance credits. And so offsetting plays a relatively small role in the road to net zero. The way to maybe think about this is it conceivable that the world could get to net zero tomorrow if everybody just bought carbon credits? And the answer is, well, there aren't that many carbon credits in the world, right? There's 35-ish billion tons of carbon emissions tied to fossil fuel consumption, and the entire voluntary carbon market is a tiny, tiny fraction of that, maybe somewhere around 2 billion or less. And so you have to think about offsets as playing a role, an incredibly catalytic role in making investments happen in the near term, but not something that you can just say, hey, we're net zero because we offset all of our emissions. That definition of net zero was accepted maybe 2-3 years ago, but it's increasingly not accepted. So we kind of have this idea that carbon neutrality or climate neutrality is an interim state that you can offset your way to, but on the way to net zero, you have to achieve more in the way of direct reductions.
Thank you. How much does it cost to get certified, and about how long is the process?
Yeah, so with our certification, the typical certification cycle lasts about 3.5 months, and that includes the work to measure your emissions, and then to develop production plans, and then to complete the carbon offsetting or compensation step. So yeah, 3.5 months. Doesn't matter whether you're a large company or a small company, that's typically what we see. And the costs, the lion's share of the costs, are going to be tied to the carbon offsets that you purchase to achieve that climate neutrality status. And so we typically see total costs, including offsets, and those offsets are purchased from folks like Native Energy. Total cost around 0.15 to 0.25% of revenues. Sometimes it's a little bit more, sometimes it's a little bit less. So not a huge chunk of total revenues. We charge as part of that a brand license fee, which allows you to use the label and helps us support the cost of our nonprofit operations. So I think that was the whole question, wasn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you, Austin. Next question. Are you seeing plans that incorporate the planned changes of suppliers, such as energy utility changes to become carbon neutral?
Definitely. I mean, we've seen all manner of things, whether it's purchasing materials, aluminum, nylon from different suppliers, shifting over toward regeneratively grown agricultural inputs, signing up for new rate plans with your utility that support 100% renewable energy. So there's all kinds of different ways to do that.
Would you suggest it is better for retailers / pet food manufacturers to offset these carbon emissions or reformulate their products to reduce their carbon footprint, or a combination of both? I think we know the answer.
Yeah, it's ideally both, and it will have to be both if we're going to get to net zero. And maybe that's a good example of talking about the difference in a world where climate neutrality is the end state. All you're doing is purchasing offsets, but that won't get us to the point where the world needs to get to. So in order to get there, you also have to be thinking about reformulating products and improving the underlying practices that are causing emissions in the first place. I think it's important, to kind of understand these two things as really going hand in hand, and the entire strategy needs to be built around both types of actions, and also to acknowledge that reducing emissions within the entire collection of companies that you probably depend on in your supply chain is not easy, and that's the point of investing in carbon credits to get near-term decrease in emissions while you're working on the longer-term changes in things like product formulations and suppliers and so forth.
I think the way you frame that's really important, Austin, in that the carbon offsets are here as a mechanism for this moment in time, and they're going to hopefully help us get to where we want to be with these key systems, agricultural systems, our energy systems, transportation systems, more fundamentally transformed to lower carbon. Purchasing an offset now can help you balance out an emission. Maybe more importantly, it can also help overcome barriers to change in particular sectors that demonstrate and illustrate what's possible, and then the offset financing is no longer needed in that particular sector for a practice change in agriculture or a new technology. Those sectors start to become lower carbon by design. So offsets are no longer needed. And I think seeing it in that way as part of an important transition is helpful.
And John, I was just looking at this question again, some of the other details. I think it is interesting. That's if true, that stat is astounding. 6.4 tons of CO2 for a medium-sized dog. For reference, the average American is probably somewhere between 20 and 30 tons. So that's a huge chunk to the average American. There's another interesting example in the human food supply chain, which is oat milk, which apparently, from what I understand, in order to produce oat milk, which actually is billed as being better for the climate, there's such limited processing capacity that oats are typically grown in the US and shipped to Canada for processing, and then the actual oat milk is shipped back to the US. So by the time the oat milk gets to you, it's traveled many, many miles. Now, what goes into the oat milk is different and lower carbon intensity than dairy, because cows are extremely carbon intensive. But it does get to this question of sort of the importance of understanding what's happening to that product in its production process. And so when we're looking at emissions for companies, we're including all that transport of goods upstream in addition to the transport of the finished product to the consumer. And I think it's certainly helpful to understand that something that looks better or looks worse doesn't necessarily net out that way once you do a complete analysis. And then this question of is it better for retailers to offset carbon emissions or reformulate their products? This is a great example. If you can find specific inputs that require fewer flight miles or road miles, then absolutely, even if it's a portion of what goes into the finished product. And that's an interesting example of how you could kind of break out in a longer term reduction strategy that maybe in year one, you're picking the vegetables and just kind of focusing on those and reducing the emissions from vegetables that go into the food. And then year two, you're focusing more on the animal products that go into the food. So anyway, it's a super interesting example or question, I think.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both again for joining us today and providing all this wonderful information. We are at about time. I know there are still a couple questions left. We will try to answer those questions offline for anyone who's interested. But again, just wanted to say thank you to Austin and Jennifer. And anyone who's still here, please just rate today's webinar. What do you think? Like we said, the webinar will be made available, the recording, and copies of all the slides will be made available within the next couple of days for all the registrants. So thank you all again. Appreciate your time and effort, and we will speak with you next time.
Thanks, John.
Great talking with you all. Thank you, John. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.